The setup required to complete an induction is held within the HR module. Once you're in there, you'll be able to go to Roles Setup. You are configured within your role to access that particular functionality. So if I go to Roles Setup and then Hiring Setup, I'll get a configuration which allows me to select what I do and do not want to be included per role in the business for their induction process. Before I get stuck into the access for the different roles, I'll go into the configuration side of what can be selected. If I go to the edit pencil at the top, you'll have different configurable items within this view. So the first one, form group, correlates to the forms in which you want to be selectable to be completed as part of the induction. So in this case, any form that's part of HR and payroll. Articles folder is any articles in the policies and procedures or QHSE module that you want to be referenced. Same thing again for files, folders, and then you click into your links so that you can add any link that you want them to go to. So say you've got a video online that you need them to watch and acknowledge, then that's where you'd be adding the links. Then you've got more ad hoc questions that you want them to fill out and answer, so that's configured within here. So your question there, what your question type is, and if you need to add a new question, it's just the section below. So once you've configured that, you'll be able to configure which roles require that information. So if I go to global, that is a top level review of items that will be inherited by the roles underneath them. So if I go into forms, it'll show the two forms that are part of that HR onboarding form group that we saw before. You can select that as part of the induction, I need the personal details form to be created and the new employee onboarding checklist. Same thing applies if I go into training logs. It'll list all of the certificate types that you'll be selecting as needing to be completed. So if I go to red card, white card, there's also the option to set it as optional or mandatory. If it's not ticked, then it's mandatory. You just go through and select all of the ones that are required from a global perspective of anybody in the business requires minimum these certifications. Then same thing for any other templates. There's license competencies where you might want to select that everybody needs to have a driver's license full in order to work for your business. Articles, you might need to have organizational context as well as internal and external issues selected as being mandatory articles that need to be acknowledged in order to complete the induction. Then it comes to settings on the right. You can either have to acknowledge that you've read this particular article. I need a checkbox selected only, or I can have a signature required only, or a combination of both. So once you've done that, you'll just go through all of the options and select accordingly what would be required. Then it clicks into files, which is any files that are within that folder group that you might need them to read and acknowledge as well. Same thing, checkbox required or signature required. Then you've got the links that you might need them to select. So if you had 10 links, you're obviously selecting which ones you want them to acknowledge. Again, checkbox required and signature required. Questions is those questions that you may want them to answer. In this one, there's only a signature required after the question. You may or may not need that if it's just extra information. So once you've made your selections, you'd hit save, and that will inherit through to all of the individual role items underneath. So if I go to crew now and forms, you'll see that those ones that we selected before are already selected as a minimum. Then you can add any additionals if you need to in this section also, and it will just impact that particular role. Same thing applies with all the others. Always remember to hit save at the end, otherwise you will be losing what you've set up. There's also extra bits that you can update, such as the description that accompanies the forms that need to be completed, and also welcome messages when you start your induction as well. Then you've got another setting, which is whether or not you've got particular people in the organization who is considered an inductor, which means you can start from your user account somebody else's induction process. So that's set up via the induction settings. There's also settings for multiple roles. If you've got somebody who you wanted to induct as part of multiple roles, then you can select multiple roles. But for this example, I'll just deselect it. I will just select KaiAdmin so you can see, which is our login for the induction of somebody else. You can also set a password in so that if you are setting up an induction and passing the tablet or device across to a person, then they can't poke around in other parts of the module as they're using your login. Typically speaking, they will create a role which is called Inductor, which restricts access to everywhere until they've completed that induction, if you're letting them do it from their login. Once that's all set up, it would be kicking into the actual completion of the induction, which there is typically a shortcut option on the shortcuts menu for complete induction. So if you're not an inductor, then you'll only see your records to fill out. But essentially, whenever you've created the record, it'll show started on the right hand side, and you'll be able to revisit that same form that's been started. So within here, it's just a basic forms template where we've got mandatory requirements of this particular form to be filled out and submitted in the same way as any other form. Same thing would apply for any other forms in there. For the training logs, you're just creating a form which will create it as a particular certificate type, and again, you're filling out any details that are required. Yeah, set that to 26. This will then link back to the training matrix that's part of the HR module, which I'll get back to after we're running through this induction process. Attach any files, comments, etc. Once that's done, submit it, and that will come through as completed on the induction. So in order to complete your induction, it requires you to have completed everything in this list, not just started it. So that's something to be monitored once the induction has been completed, and you can visit anybody's inductions as they are completed from an admin perspective. So I'll go into articles, I'll just click into that, which will open up the article itself, which will allow you to read it and acknowledge it. Once I go back, that will then have marked that as read, and I'll have that acknowledgement checkbox that I have understood, which I'll tick, and then a sign option as well. Same thing applies to the other, but this one is just a acknowledge option. So that will just have I acknowledge that I've read and understood. Files, again, as you get through it, you'll just click through and it will download a copy of the file to your computer, and then you can read it and then come back to it and again sign off that you've acknowledged that you've read it and sign off. Links will just literally, on clicking it, take you to the external link, and then once you've done that, that will mark that as completed, that you visited the link. Then those questions will just come up as, are you okay to work night shift? And you just select yes or no, essentially. Once you've completed it, it pushes through and you've got that completed. Back to that main menu and go complete induction. It'll ask who are you inducting on behalf of that your login. So if I go to Antonio, whoever that is, you're selecting what role you're inducting them into. So I'll just say crew and go start induction. That will then open up their records for that particular contact, which obviously based on the records before, there's not much selected. But yeah, they'll all be accountable for their own inductions. As you make amendments or changes to particular policies and procedures, you can change the induction to then cite a new one. So it requires them to acknowledge and read the new amended or updated procedure. That's all managed within the individual person's user account, unless you have the inductor process. So as I was saying before, if I go to any particular contact within the HR people section, I can view their inductions if they've completed it. That pretty much covers off everything to do with inductions on web. There is a separate video which we will put in the description on our subcontractor version, so our external portal external to Kim, that will assist you further.